Greetings, everyone. Here are the latest analyses of today's important developments. The $2.5 trillion shock. Russia is burning itself in the ashes of its own economy. Every loss of occupied territory in Ukraine is costing the Kremlin up to $90 million, a crazy and irrational price in the history of modern warfare. The front lines are terrifying as hunger turns soldiers into real-life demons. Shocking intelligence reports have just revealed an infuriating truth. Russian soldiers in Ukraine are having to eat their own comrades to survive extreme hunger and thirst. With a digital Iron Curtain falling, Russia is returning to the darkest period in its history, with more than 65% of small businesses collapsing and food prices soaring to insane levels. The specter of famine from the Soviet era is officially returning, strangling every Russian family. The Grand Retreat has collapsed, leaving deadly cracks in Vladimir Putin's iron armor. For the first time in over 2 decades, the people's trust in the Kremlin's master has plunged to rock bottom, as despair gradually turns into tidal waves of anger. Here is the content and detailed analysis. The specter of the Soviet era, 65% of businesses have collapsed, food inflation at 167%, and a record drop in public trust. Ladies and gentlemen, Russia and Ukraine, the confrontation is not only taking place on fiery trenches, but is also crushing the last veins of a great power. From the ambition to revive Soviet glory, Vladimir Putin is pushing Russia into the worst crisis in modern history. Why has a campaign that was expected to restore order turned into a $2.5 trillion money-burning machine? Why does every inch of occupied land come at the cost of millions of ruined lives and the despair of an entire young generation? Because when Vladimir Putin launched the attack on Ukraine, in his mind it was not just a simple military campaign, but an ambition to revive the shadow of the old Soviet Empire. He wanted to carve his name into history as a restorer of the nation, starting with reclaiming Ukraine and then moving deeper into Europe to re-establish the old order. But ironically, what the Russian president actually brings to his people is not the glory of the past, but the darkest and harshest aspects of that era. The atmosphere in Russia right now is shrouded in a terrifying silence, a darkness that is gradually swallowing all hope from within. What is happening now is even worse than the bloody chapters of history during Joseph Stalin's era. A new Soviet-style famine specter is looming, peering into every household and suffocating daily life. A wave of discontent and anger is smoldering across Russia, and all eyes are turning toward the Kremlin. The so-called special military operation has now entered its 4th year, becoming a quagmire with no way out, pushing the Russian economy to the brink of total collapse. The weight of the sanctions is crushing every effort at recovery. People who had long grown accustomed to silence under Putin's rigid regime are now beginning to show cracks in their faith, as they realize they are being pushed into a crisis reminiscent of the final days of the old Soviet Union. An anonymous Russian official shared with the Washington Post that this current mood is one of utter exhaustion. People are starting to question if this fighting is already too much. This war seems to be dragging on even longer than the Great Patriotic War, but in return, the military still hasn't been able to fully control even a small area. Even Mr. Zhanety Zhiganov, the longtime leader of the Russian Communist Party, has lost his patience. In front of the lower house of the Russian parliament, he harshly criticized the government's policies and warned that economic collapse was inevitable. He emphasized that the economy had hit rock bottom right from the first quarter of the year, and if urgent measures were not taken, the specter of the 1917 revolution would rise again next fall. This was an unprecedented act of defiance against Putin's authority, but it was only the beginning of a longer tragedy. Instead of listening to the nation's sighs, Putin chose an extremely radical response. When the country's financial reserves were depleted, with many bitter admissions from Minister of Economic Development Maxim Sedekov, Putin still had no intention of stopping. He not only maintained the war on the front lines, but also launched a new war within Russia itself, a war against the truth. By tightening control over the media, he tried to prevent voices of discontent from reaching his ears. Putin craves absolute power like Stalin, but ironically, he only suffers one failure after another instead of a mighty empire. Despair is spreading like a plague. Hyperinflation and food shortages are happening not only on the home front, but also hitting the front lines. The decline of businesses and the disorientation of the younger generation are the clearest symptoms of the new Russia that Putin has created. Russia is now lost in an economic twilight, a state of lethargy, uncertainty, and with no way out in sight. Expert Janis Klutz from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs commented that even if oil prices rise due to the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, bringing some temporary advantage, it is still not enough to save an entity that is decaying from within. The statistics have painted a disastrous picture. In the first 2 months of 2026, the Russian economy declined by 1.8% under the double pressure of high interest rates and harsh sanctions. Investments have been stifled, and Russian businesses are carrying a record debt of up to $109 billion in unpaid bills. Putin's dream of turning the entire country into a war machine has completely backfired. Even though growth at times exceeded 4% during 2023 to 2024 thanks to defense spending, that was just a brief glimmer before fading away. By 2025, growth is down to just 1%. Economist Robert Nikhmatulin from the Russian Academy of Sciences has pointed out the harsh reality that the average growth rate over the past 10 years has only been 1.5%, while consumer prices have soared by 77%. The military economic bubble that Putin created has burst, leaving behind an exhausted nation with war spending rising to insane levels. Even though the International Monetary Fund has slightly raised its growth forecast for 2026 from 0.8 to 1.1, it's like a drop of water in a barren desert. To bring in more than $100 billion in budget revenue, Russia needs oil prices to stay very high through year-end. If the conflict between the US and Iran cools down, this last lifeline will disappear and Russia will immediately fall back into a deep crisis. It's truly tragic to look back at how the Soviet Union once spent billions of dollars building its military because they actually had an empire to protect. Putin, meanwhile, has thrown $2.5 trillion into the flames, just to gain about 70,000 square kilometers in Ukraine. But the price paid is far too great. According to data from United 24, every square mile of land that Russia occupies has cost them from $90 million, $2.5 trillion over 1 million casualties, and worldwide condemnation. The $2.5 trillion that the Kremlin has poured into this war is truly an unimaginable madness. It's an extremely high price for the equipment that's been destroyed, for the depleted manpower, and for an economy that's on the verge of collapse. Now, from the privileged elite to the poorest people in Russia, everyone is sharing the same bitter question. Why do we have to sacrifice so much for a conquest that, in reality, hasn't gained us anything significant? Mr. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was once the richest man in Russia and is now leading the opposition from London, insists that the patriotic flame Putin once fanned at the start of the Ukraine campaign has now faded to ashes. The war has dragged on far beyond anyone's expectations, and gaining or losing a few small villages no longer holds any meaning for the great nation. Khodorkovsky's voice right now reflects the feelings of many Russian oligarchs who are being squeezed by sanctions but do not have the courage to speak out. However, what makes Putin even more fearful is not the discontent of the oligarchs, whom he can easily threaten with mysterious accidents, but rather the outrage of the general public. The Russian people are exhausted from being trapped in a decaying Soviet-style system, where Putin's economic mistakes are pushing them into a dead end with no future. Despair is gradually turning into direct rage that threatens to shake the very foundations of the Kremlin's power. While the oligarchs are still hesitant, small business owners in Russia are experiencing excruciating pain. They are surrounded by heavy tax policies and regulations that seem designed to push them to the brink of bankruptcy. An entrepreneur in Moscow shared with the international press that the biggest fear right now is that the government will increasingly take more from the people to fuel the war machine, which even Putin doesn't know when will end. The haunting fear of a dark era returning is coming back to the minds of people like Miss Tatiana, the manager of a 3-year-old logistics company. She is shocked to realize that the Iron Curtain, which Russians thought had permanently faded into the past, is now reappearing in the form of a digital Iron Curtain. Instead of introducing development policies, the authorities only focus on suppressing and controlling the information space to silence dissenting voices from businesses and citizens. According to shocking figures released at the end of April 2026, up to 65% of small businesses in Russia made no profit in the first quarter. These businesses are the backbone of the domestic economy, but now they are struggling with a severe labor shortage and sky-high bank interest rates. All talented human resources have been drained into defense factories or sent to the battlefield, resulting in a serious decline in tax revenue, which is 16% lower than the previous year. The future outlook for Russia is becoming even gloomier. More than 63% of business representatives believe that the situation will get even worse. While Putin and his inner circle keep living lavishly, ordinary people face a much harsher reality, especially regarding food. Although it hasn't reached the level of a terrible famine like during the Soviet era, food security is under serious threat. Even a few years ago, United Nations reports warned that millions of Russians were living in a state of undernourishment. Now, inflation has pushed food prices to unimaginable levels. In just the past 2 years, potato prices have soared by 167%, milk by 59%, and even basic slices of white bread have increased by up to 45%. The increase of value-added tax to 22% has made it even more difficult for Russian families to fill their refrigerators. Things got even worse after the record poor harvest in 2025, the worst crop in 17 years. There was a time in 2014 when Russia confidently banned food imports from the West to retaliate against sanctions. But now, with domestic production stagnating, they are forced to import food at higher prices than ever before. Although the sanctions do not directly target food, the weakening of the ruble and the disruption of supply chains are making every meal for Russian people bear the bitter taste of a war they never wanted. The Russian economy was already exhausted after pouring endless amounts of money into the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Now facing a long-term problem, they are completely powerless to bear the cost of importing food on a large scale. Although people in urban areas have not yet faced a terrible famine, like in the darkest days of the Soviet era, the shadow of food shortages is becoming increasingly apparent. However, the real tragedy is happening on the front lines, where a proper meal has become a luxury for Putin's soldiers. The people entrusted with the mission of bringing glory to Russia are actually the ones being treated the worst. A shocking report at the end of April from the Times cited evidence from Ukrainian military intelligence about disturbing scenes. Extreme hunger has forced Russian soldiers to eat the flesh of dead comrades to survive. Through dozens of intercepted audio signals, people were shocked to discover at least 5 such horrifying cases. There were even soldiers who killed their comrades just to find a way to survive in their hunger-crazed state. It's hard to imagine how bad things could get in the heart of Russia if food inflation keeps soaring and the harvests keep failing. Many hopes are gradually fading in the hearts of the Russian people, replaced by a deep sense of despair, and it is the younger generation who are bearing the brunt of this tragedy. Putin's war has taken away all the dreams of youth, pushing them into a harsh reality where the only choices left are to take up arms and go to the battlefield or work in weapons factories. While small businesses are collapsing en masse, Russian youths like the student Igor, 19 years old, can only bitterly say that everything is hopeless. Everyone wants to leave the country, but very few have the chance. Could this be Putin's intention? By pushing the economy down to the depths of the Soviet era, he has forced young people to have no other choice but to join the military. They won't have time to worry about their future because they'll be too busy facing death on the battlefield in Ukraine. Skepticism about a meat grinder is growing as Putin's promises continue to fall apart. In March 2022, he promised not to send new recruits to Ukraine, but in reality, the situation turned out to be completely different. The Russian military is now using huge bonuses to lure anyone who can hold a gun, regardless of age. These conscripts, who were originally supposed to serve their military duty in remote rear areas, now find themselves pushed straight into the inferno in Ukraine. By mid-2025, the BBC Russian service had confirmed that at least 245 soldiers who were only 18 years old had died between 2023 and 2025. Young people who are lucky enough not to be sent to the front lines still cannot escape the pressure to contribute to the war machine. According to the independent newspaper, Russia is trying to strengthen its drone forces by promising huge rewards to students to become engineers or drone operators. Although the Russian Ministry of Defense always denies forcing young people, the reality of broken promises has revealed a harsh truth. In this never-ending war, Putin always needs fresh meat to send to the battlefield. The despair spreading across Russia comes not only from material exhaustion, but also from the collapse of core values. For Putin, the suffering of the people
Có lẽ chẳng đáng kể chừng nào ông ta
still helps maintain the dictatorship that has lasted for more than a quarter of a century. However, something that the Kremlin's master never expected is beginning to happen. The voices that have long been silenced are starting to rise. According to Pravda, polls from the All-Russian Public Opinion Research Center show that Putin's approval rating has dropped for 7 consecutive weeks, now at only about 65.6%, the lowest level since 2022. The level of trust in him has also dropped to 71. That number still seems to be a majority. But it's important to remember that in a country where even a small dissenting opinion can lead to prison or worse, a drop of more than 20% from the peak of 88% is a shocking sign. The cracks in Putin's Iron Man image have started to show. When 35% of the people dare to publicly express their dissatisfaction, how many others are silently and desperately suffering behind the curtain of silence? A dead economy and the increasing demands of the war are pushing the endurance of the Russian people to their very limits. Putin may be enjoying the last remnants of power from an outdated empire, but deep down he must also understand that nothing lasts forever. So with the $2.5 trillion already poured into the war, in your opinion, how much longer can Russia hold out before its economy completely collapses? Is the current decline in the Russian people's confidence a sign of the collapse of the Putin regime?